Right now, as you are listening to this, your brain might be doing something incredibly strange. I mean, it might be treating an unread email from your boss or a weird text from a friend exactly the same way your ancient ancestors' brains treated a literal tiger rustling in the bushes.
It is the great paradox of the modern human condition. We have built an environment of unprecedented physical safety, but our nervous systems, they're behaving as if we are under constant mortal threat.
Yeah, you could be sitting perfectly still in an office chair, right? Or driving in your car or folding laundry. But internally, neurologically, you are running for your life. And you probably don't even realize it.
Most people don't. And that lack of realization is exactly why so many of us are walking around feeling completely drained.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of extreme precision. It feels like engineering.
Right, like a mechanic looking at an engine.
Exactly. If you fall and break your arm, you go to the hospital, they put you in an x-ray machine, and the film comes back with that jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it and says, there it is, that's the problem.
It's entirely binary. It is either broken or is not broken. It's a clean narrative. And honestly, human beings crave that.
We really do.
It is deeply comforting. We like our pain to be visible, to be perfectly categorized, and to have a standard 6-week cast as the solution.
But then you step into the world of human neurodevelopment, of trauma, of emotional exhaustion, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Completely useless. You are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, well, to put it mildly, it's murky. It's really messy.
Yeah, it is completely invisible to the naked eye.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You cannot put a struggling mind in an x-ray machine and point to a jagged white line of grief or a hairline fracture of chronic stress.
But the structural damage is just as real, right? And sometimes far more debilitating than a shattered bone.
Oh, without a doubt.
Okay, so let's unpack this because that muddy water is exactly what we are wading into today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring a massive, incredibly rich stack of curated material.
It's a fantastic collection of sources.
It really is. We've spent weeks going through cutting-edge psychological workbooks, transcripts from leading clinical neuroscientists, and these deeply profound spiritual reflections. And all of this material is completely centered on mental health, emotional resilience, and the actual mechanical process of inner transformation.
And what's truly fascinating here, the thing that really jumps out when you synthesize all these different fields, is how seamlessly they intersect.
Yes.
We are completely bypassing the superficial self-help cliches today. We aren't here to tell you to just, think positive or good vibes only. We want to get to the biological and psychological root of things.
Exactly. The goal today is to figure out the hard science, the behavioral psychology, and the deep, enduring spiritual wisdom behind how humans actually heal. Like, how do we grow? How do we reconnect when we feel entirely shattered?
It's such a vital question.
And I want to speak directly to you listening to us right now. Whether you are feeling completely to your bones burnt out, or maybe you are stuck in this exhausting cycle of self-doubt that you can't seem to break.
Or maybe you're just insanely curious about how the physical brain literally rewires itself.
Right, exactly. Whatever brought you here, this deep dive is custom tailored to help you make sense of it all.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what stands out is how ancient spiritual wisdom, these age-old concepts like forgiveness, grace, community, and surrender, aligns perfectly with cutting-edge functional MRI data.
It's wild how closely they mirror each other.
It really is. The theologians and the neuroscientists are essentially speaking the exact same language. They're mapping the exact same human terrain. They're just using different vocabularies to describe the landscape.
I love that. Two maps of the same territory. So before we can talk about growth, before we can talk about reaching the destination on that map, we have to accurately diagnose where we are starting from.
And for a staggering number of people today, the starting line isn't a place of neutral rest.
No, it is a state of profound structural depletion. Let's talk about emotional and mental exhaustion. Because the consensus across all these disciplines is that this isn't just having a bad day.
Right.
This isn't just needing a nap,
No, not at all. It's a fundamental depletion of your internal reserves. A great way to conceptualize this is to think of a slow leak in a tire.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
If you have a blowout, you notice it immediately.
Yeah.
The car swerves, you pull over, you fix it. But emotional exhaustion is that tiny, imperceptible puncture.
So you just keep driving.
You keep driving, you keep pushing, you keep showing up for work, for your kids, for your friends. But little by little, mile by mile, the air is leaving. Your capacity is shrinking.
Because it is a biological and psychological response to the slow drip of constant, unyielding demand.
Exactly.
The unspoken grief, the societal pressure to perform, the financial stress, the endless news cycle, it just piles up. I was reading through some of the case studies in our material, and the examples are so intensely relatable.
They really hit close to home.
They do. It's the single parent who is holding it together brilliantly for the kids all day, but then finds themselves sobbing on the floor of the shower at midnight.
Or it's the employee who is constantly covering for everyone else's mistakes with zero recognition,
Yeah.
quietly swallowing the resentment.
Yes. Or that friend, and we all have this friend, or maybe we actually are this friend who is always the absolute rock for everyone else, the one everyone calls in a crisis, but they feel totally, utterly invisible when they actually need a shoulder to lean on.
Which brings a critical systemic issue to the forefront. Let's look at how the World Health Organization classifies burnout. Initially, they classified burnout strictly as an occupational phenomenon.
Like it was just about your job.
Right, it was supposed to be something that only happened in the workplace. But the psychological reality we are seeing now, the data pouring in, shows that burnout applies far beyond the corporate world.
It applies to just existing.
Exactly. It applies to the business of everyday modern life. When life demands more output from you than it provides input to refill you, you experience a measurable clinical state of physical, emotional, and mental depletion.
And it is so often an invisible illness. That phrase just keeps coming up in the research. It goes back to that broken X-ray machine.
You might look completely fine on the outside.
Yeah, you might be dressed nicely, smiling at the barista, sending emails with lots of exclamation points. But the pain, the exhaustion is agonizingly real.
Very real.
Mhm.
The global health data we reviewed notes that nearly 1 in 4 people globally will experience a profound mental health struggle in their lifetime. 1 in 4.
That is a massive portion of the population.
Yet, because it is invisible, societal stigma silences it. Our obsession with busyness buries it. People walk around highly functioning, checking off their to-do lists while quietly breaking apart on the inside.
And to truly understand why this happens, why we can't just, tough it out, we have to look at the mechanisms.
Right, the actual biology of it.
Yeah. Psychiatrist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk famously coined the phrase, the body keeps the score. Trauma, chronic stress, unseen pain. They don't just live in your thoughts as abstract ideas.
No, they leave physical, measurable imprints on the actual tissue of your brain, your nervous system, and your immune system.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting to me. I want to drill down into that. How exactly does that work? What is the actual physical neuroscience behind this level of exhaustion?
It's all about the brain's alarm system.
Like, if I am stressed about a mortgage payment, why does my back hurt? Why can't I remember where I put my keys?
To understand that, we have to look at a small, almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is your threat detection center. Its entire job is to keep you alive.
Okay.
When you are under chronic stress, whether that is from unspoken grief, relentless financial pressure, navigating a toxic relationship, or just the chaotic pace of modern life, your amygdala gets stuck in the on position.
It just stays active.
It becomes hypervigilant. And here's the crucial part. The amygdala is incredibly fast, but it is not very smart. It cannot distinguish between a physical threat to your life and an emotional threat to your ego or security.
Wow. So that's what we were talking about at the very beginning. To my amygdala, an angry, all-caps email from a client feels exactly the same as a tiger jumping out of the bushes.
Precisely. The biological cascade is identical. When the amygdala detects that tiger, the email, the overdue bill, it instantly activates the HPA axis.
The HPA axis.
That's the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis. This system floods your bloodstream with stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline.
And that's when you feel your heart racing.
Exactly. Your heart rate spikes, your blood vessels constrict, your digestion shuts down, and your pupils dilate. Your body is instantly primed to either fight the tiger to the death or run for your life.
Which is brilliant if you are actually being chased by a tiger.
Right. In short, acute bursts. Cortisol is a miracle of evolutionary biology. It saves your life. You run faster, you fight harder.
But then what happens?
Once the threat is gone, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, the cortisol clears out of your bloodstream, and you return to baseline. You relax. But the problem is, in our modern world, the tiger never leaves.
The emails never stop? The financial stress doesn't disappear when the sun goes down?
Yes. So the alarm bell is just ringing 24/7. And chronic, unrelenting cortisol exposure is highly toxic to the human body. It is corrosive.
Corrosive, like it actually damages things.
Yes, when cortisol levels stay elevated for weeks, months, or years, it literally begins to impair the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the region of your brain responsible for memory, learning, and emotional regulation.
Oh, wow. So that explains the lost keys.
Exactly. Cortisol actually causes the dendrites, the little branches connecting your brain cells, to shrink in the hippocampus. It physically degrades your brain's infrastructure.
That is terrifying.
It destroys your ability to focus. It suppresses your immune system, which is why chronically stressed people are always catching colds. You aren't just tired because you didn't sleep well last night. Your neurological infrastructure is actively under siege.
That is deeply sobering. And it makes me think about how fundamentally flawed our approach to self-care is. It feels like we treat our minds and our bodies the exact same way we treat our smartphones.
How do you mean?
We just ignore the battery draining all day. We wait until we are at 1% battery when the screen is dimming and the warning notification pops up. Then we plug ourselves in for a frantic 15-minute charge. Maybe we drink a green juice or do a quick meditation app, and we expect to instantly boot back up and operate at maximum 100% capacity for another 12 hours.
That is a brilliant analogy.
But we aren't machines, we are organic creatures.
We consistently expect mechanistic, predictable output from a highly complex organic system. When your phone dies, you plug it in, and the lithium-ion battery recharges at a mathematical rate.
But a human being isn't a battery.
Right. You can't just plug a human into a wall. When a human is emotionally and neurologically exhausted, when their hippocampus is bathed in toxic levels of cortisol, they need profound rest. Yet our societal conditioning tells us to just push harder, to drink more caffeine, to hack our productivity.
Which is just pouring gasoline on the fire. So I want to pause here. If you are listening to this right now and you are waking up tired in your very bones, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix.
The structural kind of tired.
Yes. If you are losing interest in hobbies you once loved, or if you feel like your emotions are just stuck on a flat line of numb, or conversely, if you are snapping at the people you love over the smallest things, I want to validate you right now.
It's so important to hear that.
Based on everything we are reading in the science, this is not a moral failure. You are not lazy. You are not weak. What you are experiencing is a highly predictable biological response to carrying far too much weight for far too long. You are at capacity.
And simply acknowledging that capacity, saying out loud, I am at my limit, is the vital first step. But the great tragedy of our modern culture is that because society actively rewards the grind, because we give medals to the people who sleep the least and work the most, our instinct isn't to ask for help when we reach that capacity.
No, our instinct is to hide it.
Exactly. We hide it.
We throw on armor, we go into self-protection mode because we look around the office or we scroll through our social media feeds, and everyone else seems to be surviving just fine.
They seem to be crushing it, actually.
Which leads us into the next massive theme in the research. The masks we wear, the silence we keep, and the absolute soul-crushing trap of comparison.
This is where we shift from neuroscience into behavioral psychology. Psychologists refer to this as self-presentation theory.
Self-presentation theory. Okay, what does that mean practically?
This is the foundational concept that from a very young age, starting in childhood, we learn to meticulously curate our behavior. We figure out what the adults around us praise and what they punish.
Right, the gold stars in kindergarten.
Exactly. We figure out what our peers think is cool and what gets us mocked. And we use that data to curate an image. We do this to gain approval, to avoid the pain of rejection, and fundamentally, to secure our belonging in the tribe. We build masks.
Smile when you're sad. Act strong when you feel incredibly weak. Never let them see you sweat. We are conditioned from birth to perform our lives rather than actually live them.
Yes. And we should be clear. In moderation, some level of social adaptation is perfectly normal and necessary.
Like you don't act the same way at a funeral as you do at a party.
Right. You wear a slightly different mask when you are interviewing for a job than you do when you're hanging out with your best friend.
Yeah.
That's just social intelligence.
Yeah.
But the acute danger is when the mask becomes the identity.
When you forget who is underneath it.
When the performance becomes the only version of you that anyone ever gets to see, you experience severe, profound psychological disconnection. Because here's the brutal irony of the mask. Even if people praise the mask, even if they shower the mask with love, deep down, you still feel profoundly unloved and alone.
Oh, wow.
Because you know they aren't loving you, they are loving a performance you are putting on.
It's like imposter syndrome on an existential level. And speaking of imposter syndrome, I was fascinated by the inclusion of Maya Angelou in the psychological profiling here.
It's a striking example.
I mean, Maya Angelou, arguably one of the most brilliant, celebrated, impactful authors and poets in human history. She had honorary degrees she read at presidential inaugurations.
She was a literary titan.
And yet she famously admitted that every single time she published a new book, she would think to herself, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody, and they're finally going to catch me.
It's staggering, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If someone with the objective, historic brilliance of Maya Angelou lived with the fear of being found out, it proves that this fear isn't rational. It is a universal human condition.
It makes me feel a lot better about my own imposter syndrome, honestly. If Maya felt it, we're all off the hook. But where does this constant need to measure ourselves against others come from? Why can't we just run our own race?
Because we are biologically wired not to. In the 1950s, a social psychologist named Leon Festinger defined what he called social comparison theory.
Okay.
Festinger proposed that human beings have an innate, primal drive to evaluate their own progress, worth, and social standing. And because there is no objective yardstick for human worth, we evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to the people around us.
So it's an evolutionary thing.
Evolutionarily, this made perfect sense. If you were living in a small hunter-gatherer tribe of 50 people, comparison was a survival mechanism. You needed to know who has the sharpest spear, who is the fastest runner.
Who knows which berries are poisonous?
Exactly. By comparing yourself, you learned who to emulate to stay alive, and you learned where you fit in the tribal hierarchy.
Okay, that makes sense for a tribe of 50 people foraging in the woods.
Yeah.
But Festinger didn't anticipate the internet. He didn't anticipate the smartphone.
No, he didn't. Our evolutionary survival instincts have been completely hijacked by a digital world. We are no longer comparing ourselves to the hunter in the next tent. We are comparing ourselves to 7 billion people simultaneously.
It's just too much data for the brain to process.
And the comparison is entirely asymmetrical. We aren't comparing our real, messy, three-dimensional lives to their real, messy lives. We are comparing our chaotic, unedited, behind-the-scenes footage to their meticulously curated, filtered, heavily edited highlight reels.
It is a rigged game. Let's dig into the emotional fallout of this, because the psychology breaks this down into two distinct mechanisms: upward comparison and downward comparison. And neither of them seem to end well.
No, they are both highly destructive traps. Upward comparison is what we do most often on social media.
That's when we look at people doing better than us, right?
Right. It's when you look at someone who appears to be more successful, wealthier, more attractive, or happier than you. When you engage in upward comparison, your brain immediately zeroes in on what you lack.
It highlights the gap.
Exactly. The gap between where you are and where they appear to be triggers intense feelings of inadequacy, which fuels depression and anxiety. It inflames that inner critic we were talking about.
And downward comparison, that's when we look at someone who we perceive as doing worse than us.
Correct. You look at someone struggling, or you watch a reality TV show about people making terrible life choices. And for a brief moment, your brain gives you a hit of dopamine. You feel a fleeting sense of superiority or relief.
Like, well, at least my life isn't that much of a disaster.
But that feeling is incredibly fragile, and it is almost always followed by a subconscious wave of guilt or shame for taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. It corrodes your empathy.
So upward comparison makes you feel worthless, and downward comparison makes you feel toxic. It is a lose-lose cycle.
It really is.
It makes me think about it this way. Constant comparison is like trying to navigate your own personal road trip using someone else's GPS.
Oh, I like that.
You're sitting in your car, but you're looking at their screen. So you are constantly turning left where they turned left and stopping where they stopped. But you end up completely, hopelessly lost.
Because you didn't start from the same place.
Exactly. You didn't start your journey from the same place they did. You aren't driving the same vehicle, and you aren't actually trying to go to the same destination. You just copied their route because it looks scenic on Instagram.
That analogy perfectly captures the deep disorientation of comparison. You are aggressively measuring your progress on a map that you aren't even on. And the toll this takes on our collective mental health is absolutely staggering.
The research backs this up, right?
Yes. There was a major 2018 study from the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology that tracked this exact phenomenon. They found that when people consistently suppress their true emotions and identity, when they constantly wear the mask and engage in this endless loop of social comparison, they don't just feel a little insecure. They experience drastically higher, clinical levels of generalized anxiety, severe depression, and profound loneliness. The mask literally makes us sick.
So if the mask is making us sick and the GPS of comparison is getting us lost, what is the alternative? How do we break the loop?
It starts by asking yourself a very pointed question. I want you, the listener, to really reflect on this. When was the exact last time that comparison stole your joy?
That's a hard question to answer, honestly.
It is. Maybe you were proud of a project you finished until you saw a colleague's project. Maybe you were happy with your home until you went to a friend's dinner party. What triggered that theft of joy? And more importantly, what would happen in your brain if in that exact moment of triggering, you consciously chose to shift your perspective from comparison to curiosity?
Curiosity. Okay, unpack that. How do we do that?
Instead of the knee-jerk reaction of saying, why don't I have what they have? What is wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
What if you paused, took a breath, and asked, what an interesting path they've taken? What can I learn from their journey?
Just a slight pivot in phrasing.
But neurologically, it's huge. Curiosity deactivates the threat response. It moves you out of the amygdala and into the prefrontal cortex, the logical learning part of your brain.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Comparison shrinks your world down to a zero-sum game of winners and losers. Curiosity expands your world into a classroom. I really like that.
It's a much healthier place to live.
But realistically, to actually take the mask off, to actually put down the other person's GPS and admit we feel lost, we have to confront the ultimate boss level of this whole video game.
The inner critic.
We have to confront the thing that is aggressively keeping the mask glued to our faces. The inner critic.
Yes, the voice inside your own head that insists with absolute certainty that hiding is the only way to stay safe.
Let's pull the curtain back on this voice. We are moving into how we step into the light, deconstruct this inner critic, and actually embrace vulnerability. But first, from a biological perspective, where does this incredibly cruel, hypercritical voice even come from? Because nobody is born hating themselves.
No, they aren't. And this is where evolutionary psychology provides so much clarity. The inner critic actually evolved as an essential tribal survival mechanism.
Going back to the tribe of 50 again.
Exactly. In ancient times, if you stepped out of line, if you made a foolish mistake, if you angered the tribal elders or embarrassed yourself, you risked being ostracized. You risked being cast out of the tribe.
And back then, you couldn't just move to a new city.
No. In a prehistoric world, isolation didn't just mean you were lonely. It meant you were going to freeze or starve. Rejection equaled literal death.
So the stakes couldn't have been higher.
Exactly. So over thousands of years, the human brain developed this internal, overprotective security guard, the inner critic. Its job was to constantly monitor your behavior, anticipate how others would judge you, and aggressively correct you before you could make a mistake that would get you kicked out of the tribe.
It kept you in line.
It made you conform. It screamed at you to avoid risks. Don't speak up, they'll laugh at you. Don't try that, you'll fail and look stupid.
But in modern life, we aren't at risk of being exiled to the tundra if we fail a PowerPoint presentation. But the security guard doesn't know that. The security guard is completely out of control, acting like a tyrant.
It's operating on outdated hardware.
Instead of saving our lives, it actively sabotages our growth.
It wildly overreacts to modern social friction. It tells us we are fundamentally broken, that we aren't good enough, that we shouldn't even bother trying to change. And the only known antidote to that overprotective, paralyzing isolation is the very thing the inner critic is terrified of: vulnerability.
This is where we have to fundamentally flip the script on how society talks about feelings. Society, particularly Western corporate culture, tells us that vulnerability is a liability. It's a fragility.
Right, it's seen as weakness.
But the hard neurobiology we were reading says something entirely different.
Science frames vulnerability not as a weakness, but as an absolute biological imperative for neurological healing. Think about the physiological mechanics we discussed earlier.
With the cortisol and the amygdala.
Yes. Suppressing your emotions, holding it all in to maintain the mask and appease the inner critic requires massive amounts of energy. It keeps the sympathetic nervous system engaged. It keeps cortisol pumping through your veins.
Your body is physically bracing for impact all day long.
But when you do the opposite, when you take a deep breath and share a true, unvarnished feeling with another human being, when you engage in vulnerability, your brain undergoes a radical chemical shift. It releases a rush of oxytocin.
The bonding hormone.
Precisely. Oxytocin is the neurochemical antagonist to cortisol. When oxytocin floods your system, it literally acts as a vasodilator, opening up your blood vessels. It lowers your blood pressure. It slows your heart rate. It calms the amygdala.
So it's the biological opposite of stress.
The research is robust on this. We looked at studies out of Harvard where researchers monitored groups of people engaging in dialogue. The groups that were instructed to share personal struggles and display vulnerability didn't just report feeling closer to one another. Their biological markers of stress plummeted.
That's incredible.
Vulnerability literally heals the physical body by transitioning the nervous system out of chronic fight or flight and into what we call a state of tendon befriend.
Okay, but how do we practically do this? Because if someone has been wearing armor for 20 years, you can't just tell them to strip naked in the town square. That's terrifying.
It is terrifying, and it's dangerous.
The psychology outlines some really practical stepping stones, right? Like starting small.
Extremely small. You do not have to spill your deepest, darkest childhood traumas on day one. You start with what psychologists call micro-truths. It's the practice of simply naming your current emotional reality out loud.
So instead of the default automated, I'm fine, everything's great, when someone asks how you are, a micro-truth would be saying something else.
Right. It would be saying, honestly, I'm feeling incredibly overwhelmed today.
Just that.
Or, I'm feeling really anxious about this meeting. The simple act of naming the emotion, which is clinically called emotional labeling, has a profound neurological effect. Functional MRI scans show that just putting a specific word to your emotional pain actually decreases the activity in the brain's distress centers.
Just by saying the word anxious.
Yes. You are using the language centers of your prefrontal cortex to literally put the brakes on the amygdala's panic. You are reframing vulnerability as a bridge to connect with another human rather than viewing it as a crack in your protective armor.
Okay, but I have to push back here. I have to play devil's advocate for the listener who is thinking, this sounds great in the lab, but the real world is vicious.
That's a fair point.
Isn't there a very real, very dangerous risk in being too vulnerable? If I take my armor off and expose my soft spots and I do it with the wrong person, a narcissistic boss, a manipulative partner, a gossiping friend, that vulnerability will be instantly weaponized against me. They will take the very thing I shared and use it to hurt me.
That is an incredibly valid, vital concern. And we need to be crystal clear. The clinical literature does not advocate for reckless, indiscriminate vulnerability.
Okay, good.
That is emotional self-harm. The leading voices in this space, most notably Dr. Brené Brown, are incredibly precise on this point. Brown famously says, you share with people who have earned the right to hear your story.
Earned the right. I love the weight of that phrase.
Vulnerability absolutely requires establishing baseline trust and psychological safety first. You do not hand your deepest, most tender wounds to someone who has a track record of violating your boundaries. You don't share your soul with someone who lacks empathy.
So how do you know who is safe?
You test the waters. You drop a micro-truth. You say, I'm having a hard day, and you watch how they respond. Do they change the subject? Do they make it about themselves? Do they judge you?
And if they do?
If so, the armor stays on. But if they lean in, if they validate you, if they say, me too, I'm so sorry, how can I help? Then they have earned a slightly deeper level of trust. You build the bridge plank by plank.
Okay, so let's say we've done that. Let's say we've navigated the murky waters. We've found that safe space, a good friend, a therapist, a trusted partner. We've started unmasking. We've dropped the micro-truths. We are ready to heal. How does the actual structural transformation happen?
This is where expectations get tricky.
Because, I'm going to be honest, movies have completely ruined our expectations for healing.
They really have.
The movies promise us this spectacular overnight miracle. The protagonist hits rock bottom. There is a dramatic, sweeping orchestral score. They have a massive crying breakdown in the pouring rain. They have a singular epiphany. And the next morning they wake up and their entire life is fixed.
Roll credits.
Exactly. They are completely healed.
Yep.
But that's not how human biology works.
It is the exact opposite of how human biology works. Which brings us to the clinical reality of transformation, what researchers call the slow rebuild. I tell my clients this all the time, and it always disappoints them initially. Real healing is profoundly anticlimactic.
It's boring. The literature literally warns that healing will feel incredibly boring compared to the chaos of trauma.
It is entirely uncinematic. It is the slow, unsexy grind of sustainable habit change. It is not an instant transformation.
What does it actually look like then?
Real healing is dragging yourself to therapy on a Tuesday afternoon when you feel like you have nothing new to say and you don't feel any different than last week. It is choosing to write in a journal for 5 minutes instead of pouring a drink and spiraling. It is the accumulation of microscopic shifts in behavior.
And there is hard empirical data on the timeline of this. We've all heard that myth that it takes 21 days to build a habit.
Right, the 21-day myth.
But the real science, specifically the longitudinal research out of University College London and Harvard Medical School, shows that sustainable automatic habit change takes an average of 66 days. And for complex emotional habits, it can take much longer.
66 days is a long time to sustain a new behavior without seeing massive results.
Exactly, 66 days. That means setting a new boundary with your mother or adopting a new growth mindset is going to feel unnatural, clunky, and exhausting for at least 2 months before it starts to feel normal. It takes time on purpose.
And we need to understand why it takes time. You are dealing with the physical reality of neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
This is the brain's remarkable ability to physically reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout your life. But your brain is made of physical matter. Changing it is a physical metabolic process.
So it's not just a change of heart.
No, when you engage in a new behavior or when you practice cognitive reframing, like the shift from a passive victim mentality to an active growth mindset, which was popularized by psychologist Carol Dweck, you are not just changing your mind. You are literally microscopically carving new physical pathways through the tissue of your brain.
It's like hacking a brand new path through a dense, overgrown jungle.
That's a perfect visual.
The first time you walk it, it is miserable. You are swinging a machete, you're getting scratched, it's exhausting, and you barely make any progress. The old familiar path, the path of self-doubt and anxiety, is a paved, multi-lane highway.
It's the path of least resistance.
It's so easy to just drive down the anxiety highway.
Yeah.
But every single time you force yourself to walk the new path in the jungle, you trample down the weeds a little more. And neurologically, the more a pathway is used, the brain wraps it in a fatty substance called myelin, which makes the signals travel faster.
Yes, myelination.
So the new path gets wider and faster until eventually it becomes the paved road. And the old highway of despair. Because you stop using it, the brain prunes those connections. The jungle overgrows the old road.
That is a flawless explanation of synaptic pruning and myelination. Neurons that fire together wire together. That is the literal architecture of change. And because hacking through a jungle is so exhausting, behavioral scientists like B.J. Fogg at Stanford recommend a concept called tiny habits.
Tiny habits. I love this part.
The strategy is to completely bypass the brain's resistance to change by shrinking the new behavior until it feels laughably, almost insultingly easy.
Give me an example of how that works in real life, especially for someone in that state of profound exhaustion we talked about earlier.
If you are in the depth of a depressive episode or severe burnout, setting a goal to deep clean the entire house this weekend is a monumental threat to your depleted nervous system.
Your amygdala will just sound the alarm.
Your brain will completely shut it down, you will fail, and the inner critic will use that failure as evidence that you are worthless. So you use a tiny habit. You shrink the goal. Your new goal is to take a damp cloth and wipe down exactly 1 square foot of the kitchen counter. That's it. It takes 10 seconds.
But how does wiping one counter actually change anything? The house is still a mess.
Because it is not about the cleanliness of the counter, it is about the neurochemistry of the accomplishment. When you complete that tiny 10-second task, your brain registers a win. It releases a small, crucial dose of dopamine.
Oh, interesting.
That dopamine gives you a tiny spark of motivation and energy, which often makes you think, well, I have cloth in my hand, I might as well wipe the rest of the counter, and then maybe I'll put this one plate in the dishwasher. The tiny habit triggers a dopamine cascade. You bypass the overwhelm and build momentum through micro wins.
This framework applies so powerfully to how we handle emotional setbacks, too. The material focuses heavily on how we process rejection. Instead of letting rejection confirm the inner critic's bias, we can reframe rejection as redirection.
Reframing is a powerful tool.
And the examples they cite are iconic. We're talking about J.K. Rowling, who was rejected by 12 different major publishers before anyone would take a chance on Harry Potter.
12 publishers.
We're talking about Oprah Winfrey, who was famously fired from one of her early television reporting jobs because a producer told her she wasn't fit for television.
Can you imagine being the producer who fired Oprah?
Right, but look at the neurological mechanics of what Rowling and Winfrey did. They did not let the rejection become their identity. They didn't travel down the old paved highway of "I am a failure."
They actively chose to swing the machete and carve a new path.
Exactly. They used the rejection as data, they used it as feedback, and over time, through the sheer repetition of neuroplasticity, a brain that is highly practiced in this kind of cognitive reframing will literally default to hope and possibility rather than defaulting to despair and defeat.
It becomes the new paved road.
It makes me think of orthodontics. It's exactly like putting braces on your teeth. When you have braces, you don't feel your teeth moving day to day. If you look in the mirror on Tuesday, your smile looks exactly the same as it did on Monday.
It's imperceptible.
And if you tried to rush the process, if you grabbed a pair of pliers and pulled on the teeth with your hands to force them straight, they would instantly snap and break. The bone can't handle violent, sudden change.
It would be disastrous.
But the constant, gentle, almost imperceptible pressure of the wire over 2 years, it entirely reshapes the bone structure of your jaw. That is the slow rebuild. Constant, gentle pressure.
Constant, gentle pressure. I want listeners to write that down. That is the mantra for neuroplasticity.
But here's a massive roadblock. This is the giant boulder sitting in the middle of our newly paved jungle path.
We can't ignore the baggage.
Right. We can try to build these new neural pathways. We can practice tiny habits all day long. We can put the gentle pressure on. But if we are still dragging around the heavy, toxic baggage of past resentments, that slow rebuild will eventually collapse under the weight.
It's structurally unsound.
You cannot build a healthy new house on a foundation of rotting bitterness.
Which brings us to perhaps the most intense, challenging aspect of this entire deep dive, the ultimate detox. The science, the psychology, the spirit of forgiveness.
You are right. This is the most challenging concept we are discussing, primarily because forgiveness is so deeply culturally misunderstood. It carries so much baggage.
It really does. To understand the science of forgiveness, we have to start by aggressively clearing the slate and defining what forgiveness is not.
Yes, let's clear the air on this because people get extremely defensive about forgiveness, and rightly so. Based on the psychological frameworks we have, forgiveness is not reconciliation.
It does not mean you have to be friends with the person who hurt you.
Right. It is not forgetting. You don't get amnesia about the abuse. And it is certainly absolutely not excusing the behavior or saying that what they did was okay.
Exactly. The clinical definition of forgiveness is completely internally focused. Forgiveness is not about letting the offender off the hook. It is about pulling the hook out of your own heart.
Pulling the hook out.
It is a conscious, deliberate decision to release the grip of historical pain on your present reality. It is deciding to stop letting a wrong that happened in the past dictate your nervous system in the present.
The material highlights some specific clinical work on this, right?
Yes, the pioneering work of Dr. Robert Enright in forgiveness therapy, as well as Dr. Everett Worthington's famous REACH-A model of forgiveness.
I found the REACH model incredibly helpful because it gives a structural process to something so abstract. REACH is an acronym. It stands for Recall the Hurt Objectively. Empathize with the offender's humanity, which is incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible for some.
Offer the altruistic gift of forgiveness, recognizing that you have also needed forgiveness in your life. Commit publicly or privately to forgive. And finally, hold on to that forgiveness when the memories inevitably trigger you again.
What Worthington and Enright's clinical models prove is that forgiveness is a continuous process. It is a muscle you flex over and over, not a light switch you flip once.
It's a daily practice.
And when you look at the physiological impact of engaging in this process, the data is absolutely stunning.
Let's talk about the Stanford University research on this, because this blew my mind.
The Stanford Forgiveness Project is a landmark study. Researchers took individuals who were holding on to severe, deep-seated grievances and put them through forgiveness training.
And what happened?
They found that the active practice of forgiveness drastically, measurably reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, and physically strengthens the immune system.
Just from deciding to forgive.
Yes, but the most compelling data came from the functional MRI scans. When they put people in scanners and guided them to actively choose forgiveness, the regions of the brain tied to empathy and emotional regulation lit up, while the amygdala calmed down.
The threat center turned off.
Think about what we said earlier about the tiger. When you hold a grudge, every time you think about that person who betrayed you, your brain thinks the tiger is back in the room. Unforgiveness keeps your sympathetic nervous system firing. It keeps you locked in a chronic cortisol loop.
So forgiveness is the cure.
Forgiveness physically heals the cellular damage in your body by permanently deactivating that specific threat response.
Okay, I hear the science, I believe the MRI scans, but I have to ask the incredibly hard, painful question that I know our listeners are screaming at their radios right now.
I know exactly what you're going to ask.
How in the world do you forgive someone who isn't sorry? How do you forgive someone who ruined a chapter of your life, who caused you immense trauma, and who feels absolutely zero remorse, who maybe even laughs about it?
It's agonizing.
Because from a human justice perspective, forgiving them feels like a massive betrayal of yourself. It feels like you're giving them a free pass. You're letting them get away with it.
That is the most common, the most visceral, and the most painful barrier to forgiveness. And it is a completely natural reaction. Your sense of justice is offended. But the psychological reality presented across both the neuroscientific and spiritual texts is stark, and we have to face it. Unforgiveness is like drinking rat poison and patiently waiting for the rat to die.
Wow, rat poison.
You are the only one suffering the toxic cellular effects of that bitterness. The person who hurt you, they aren't losing sleep. Their blood pressure isn't spiking. They aren't bathed in cortisol. You are. You are holding yourself hostage in a prison where the door is already unlocked. I love the analogy one of the psychologists used. Forgiveness is ripping up the receipt for a massive debt.
Ripping up the receipt.
You rip up the receipt not because they deserve it, not as a favor to them, but so that you don't have to carry the agonizing weight of the ledger anymore.
You just stop keeping track.
You are deciding, I am no longer going to spend the rest of my finite, precious life waiting for a repayment that is never going to come. Forgiveness is the ultimate act of separating yourself from the offender's ongoing power over your life.
Ripping up the receipt so you don't have to carry the debt. That shifts everything. You're just deciding waiting for this apology is actively destroying my life, and I choose my life over my vengeance.
It's an act of self-preservation.
And we can't talk about ripping up receipts without talking about the person we hold the most receipts for, ourselves. The material is so poignant on the intense burden of self-forgiveness.
We are our own harshest critics.
So often, we are infinitely harder on ourselves than we would ever be on a stranger. We walk around carrying this heavy backpack full of stones, actively punishing ourselves for mistakes we made 5, 10, 20 years ago.
And the physiological mechanism of self-loathing is exactly the same as holding a grudge against someone else. It keeps your threat response active.
But how do we let ourselves off the hook without just becoming reckless?
Self-forgiveness is not about escaping accountability or minimizing the harm you caused. It is about deeply acknowledging that you are a flawed, evolving human being who is capable of learning.
Giving yourself permission to grow.
If you made a terrible mistake in the past, and you learned from it, and you've changed your behavior, continuing to punish the present version of you for the sins of the past version of you entirely arrests your further development.
You stay stuck.
You cannot shame yourself into sustainable growth. Shame is a paralyzing emotion. You can only love yourself forward into becoming a better person.
So we do the work. We rip up the receipt for the person who hurt us. We take off the heavy backpack of stones we've been carrying for our own mistakes. But when forgiveness actually clears out that toxic poison of resentment, it leaves a massive void behind.
You're suddenly empty.
The anger that fueled you for years is gone. And to truly heal, the science says we cannot stay empty. We have to proactively fill that newly cleared space with profound connection.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
And we engineer that connection through the deliberate practice of empathy and gratitude.
Yes, rewiring for connection. Let's break down the mechanics of empathy first, because the psychological literature is very specific here. Empathy is not just one monolithic, vague feeling of being nice.
It's structurally broken down into 3 distinct sequential types.
First, there's cognitive empathy.
Yeah.
This is the intellectual ability to understand what someone else is thinking or why they hold a certain perspective. It's taking their point of view.
Like, I see why you're upset.
Next is emotional empathy. This is the physical, visceral sensation of actually feeling their emotions in your own body. You see them cry and your chest physically tightens.
And the third type.
And finally, the highest level, compassionate empathy. This is when cognitive understanding and emotional resonance combine to physically move you to take action and help them.
The physiological basis for this is just incredible. The whole concept of mirror neurons.
Exactly. In the 1990s, neuroscientists discovered mirror neurons in primates and later in humans. These are spiralized brain cells that literally fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that exact same action.
So my brain mimics your brain.
If I watch you accidentally hit your thumb with a hammer, the pain centers in my brain will faintly light up. We are quite literally, structurally hardwired to connect. We are wired to feel what others feel.
And what's amazing is that this wiring can be trained. It can be strengthened like a muscle. I was entirely fascinated by the Roots of Empathy program mentioned in the educational research.
That program is a perfect example of applied neuroplasticity.
This is an actual program they run in elementary schools, often in rougher neighborhoods. Once a month, they bring a mother and her young baby into a classroom of 9-year-olds. The kids don't read a textbook about feelings. They just sit in a circle and observe the baby.
They just watch.
They watch the baby's emotions, its frustrations, its cries, its joys. The instructor asks the kids, "Why do you think the baby is crying? What is he feeling right now?" And over the course of the school year, just by observing and collectively practicing empathy for this vulnerable infant, the children learn profound emotional regulation.
The results are undeniable.
The data shows that bullying in those schools plummets and cooperation and academic success skyrocket. Watching a baby completely changes the neurological dynamic of a classroom.
Because the children are literally strengthening the synaptic connections in their empathy circuits. They are practicing cognitive and emotional empathy in a safe environment. And the companion to empathy in this rewiring process is gratitude.
Gratitude. Now, this is a word that gets thrown around a lot.
The neuroscientific literature describes gratitude as the ultimate neurological reset button.
But again, to be clear, we are not talking about toxic positivity. We aren't saying smile through the pain.
No, not at all. Clinical gratitude is not ignoring reality. It is choosing to widen your lens to include the good alongside the bad. The studies out of Indiana University demonstrate this powerfully.
Oh, the gratitude letter study.
Yes. They took participants who were seeking mental health counseling for depression and anxiety and had one group write gratitude letters to people who had positively impacted them. The researchers found through fMRI scans that engaging in this specific gratitude practice significantly increased neuromodulation in the medial prefrontal cortex.
So it changed their brain chemistry?
It activated the brain's reward system, releasing sustained hits of dopamine and serotonin. And incredibly, the positive brain changes were still measurable 3 months after they stopped writing the letters.
3 months? That is profound structural change.
Gratitude acts very similarly to a pharmaceutical antidepressant, but without the side effects. It forces a cognitive shift from a primal mindset of scarcity and threat to a higher-order mindset of abundance and safety.
I was trying to conceptualize this, and the analogy that makes the most sense to me is thinking of the brain as a search engine, like Google. Gratitude is the act of manually changing your SEO keywords.
That's a great way to visualize it.
If your default keywords for the last decade have been disaster, scarcity, threat, and injustice, the algorithm of your brain is going to constantly scour your environment to autofill your reality with evidence of those things. You will find anxiety everywhere you look.
Confirmation bias.
But if you force the algorithm to search for new keywords, blessing, opportunity, kindness, and connection, you aren't ignoring the bad stuff, but you are forcing the search engine to highlight what is good and present. You fundamentally change the search results of your daily life.
That is a brilliant analogy for the psychological concept of cognitive reappraisal. You are taking control of the filtering mechanism of your own perception. Your brain finds what it is actively looking for.
And here is where the entire narrative of these sources culminates.
Yes, the macro application.
As we rewire our own individual brains for empathy and gratitude, as we heal our own nervous systems, that internal shift naturally, inevitably spills over into our external world. The micro affects the macro.
Because we don't heal in a vacuum. We aren't isolated brains in jars. We live in families, we work in organizations, we exist in communities and massive societies.
And the culmination of all this text makes it undeniably clear that the profound healing we do internally is the exact blueprint required to heal our external divided world. But, and this is a crucial but, that external healing requires a container.
It requires boundaries.
It requires structure. You can't just pour empathy out endlessly without boundaries.
Boundaries are the absolute prerequisite for sustainable peace. The literature draws a very sharp, necessary contrast between people-pleasing and healthy boundaries.
They are completely different things.
People-pleasing, as we discussed earlier, is rooted in fear. It is rooted in the mask. It is an anxious attempt to control how other people perceive you by constantly abandoning your own needs.
And boundaries.
Boundaries, on the other hand, are rooted in authenticity and deep self-respect. Boundaries are how you protect the delicate, slow rebuild of your nervous system. They are the fences that keep the tigers out while your garden grows.
And this application of boundaries and empathy applies so heavily to our intimate relationships. The text references the legendary relationship research of Dr. John Gottman.
Gottman's work is foundational.
He can predict with over 90% accuracy whether a marriage will end in divorce by observing a couple argue for just a few minutes. And he bases this on the presence of what he calls the 4 horsemen of relationship failure.
Yes, the 4 horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Contempt, which is mocking, eye-rolling, acting superior, is the single greatest predictor of divorce.
It's just toxic to the relationship.
It destroys the psychological safety of the relationship. It puts the partner's brain into a constant state of threat. Stonewalling, where one partner completely shuts down and refuses to engage, is actually a physical symptom of physiological flooding.
They're just overwhelmed.
Their heart rate is over 100 beats per minute. They're in pure fight or flight. But Gottman doesn't just diagnose the poison. He provides the antidotes. The antidotes are gentleness, building a culture of respect and appreciation, taking personal responsibility instead of getting defensive, and remaining open to physiological soothing.
Which psychologists call co-regulation.
Exactly. When you have done your own internal healing, your calm, regulated nervous system can physically help calm the panicked nervous system of your partner. You lend them your peace.
That is so beautiful. You lend them your peace. And what absolutely blew me away is that the sources don't stop at marriages or friendships. They take these exact same neurological principles of co-regulation and forgiveness, and they scale them up to the geopolitical, societal level.
This is where it gets really inspiring.
They ask the ultimate question. How do faith, profound love, and cognitive empathy bridge massive, violent, tribal, racial, and religious divides?
This is where the neuroplasticity of the individual maps perfectly onto macrosociology. The sources examine historical examples of profound, almost miraculous societal healing.
Like Rwanda.
They look at post-genocide Rwanda, where neighbors who had committed unspeakable atrocities against one another underwent intensive community-led truth and reconciliation processes, choosing the agonizing path of forgiveness in order to live side by side again.
And South Africa.
They look at post-apartheid South Africa. They highlight interfaith councils in volatile regions of Nigeria, where Christian and Muslim leaders who have every historical reason to hate each other actively work together to form human shields to protect each other's places of worship.
It provides empirical, historical proof that division is a choice, not an inescapable human destiny. The exact same psychological mechanics of forgiveness that free an individual from the prison of bitterness can literally free an entire nation from the cycle of vengeance.
Because on a macro scale, it operates on the principle of social buffering. We know that having supportive, loving relationships reduces trauma symptoms in an individual.
So you scale that up.
When entire communities choose radical unity, empathy, and truth over tribalism and revenge, they actually reduce the collective cortisol of the society. The entire society moves out of fight or flight. In this context, love and integration transition from being abstract, poetic ideals into tangible, geopolitical tools for community survival and development.
The material also brings up a fascinating point about how we view wealth and greed in this rewired society. When your brain is trapped in a scarcity loop, wealth becomes an idol.
Greed is essentially a trauma response.
Exactly. It's hoarding resources because you believe there is never enough and you are fundamentally unsafe. But the spiritual and societal wisdom argues that true wealth isn't hoarding. Hoarding actually reduces the empathy centers in the brain.
True wealth is impact.
It is using your surplus to build schools, to fund health clinics, to ensure your neighbor's children have food. It is using resources to actively bridge divides rather than building higher, thicker walls to hide behind.
Greed deeply isolates the human soul. Generosity profoundly connects it. When a society begins to be rewired by empathy, poverty naturally shrinks because communities pool their resources.
And corruption falls.
Corruption falls because the deep love and responsibility for the collective outweighs the anxious greed of the individual. The healing cascades outward.
So, to you, the listener, the person who has been on this deep dive with us today, I want to ask you a question. Look at your own life. Look at your own sphere of influence. Where can you inject a little bit of curiosity today where judgment usually lives?
Where can you show gentle, boundary-led love today?
in a place where hatred, division, or estrangement has reigned, because the entirety of this material makes one thing incredibly clear. Your inner healing is not a selfish endeavor. It is not just for you. Your restored nervous system is the exact blueprint required for your community's healing.
The micro always affects the macro.
Okay, let's take a breath and summarize the arc of this incredible, heavy, but beautiful journey we've been on. We started by diagnosing the profound, often invisible emotional exhaustion so many of us are carrying, the slow leak in the tire.
And we recognize that it is a very real biological reality driven by an overactive threat response, not a failure of willpower.
We then examined the heavy armor we wear to hide that exhaustion. We looked at the carefully curated masks of self-presentation and how using the GPS of social comparison inevitably leads us into a wilderness of loneliness and anxiety.
We talked about how to step out of the shadows, how to disarm the cruel inner critic by leaning into the biological, oxytocin-releasing power of safe, measured vulnerability, earning the right to hear each other's stories.
From there, we explored the actual architecture of change. We accepted that healing is the slow, uncinematic rebuild of our neural pathways, achieved through tiny, easily achievable habits and the constant, gentle pressure of neuroplasticity.
We tackled the hardest part, the ultimate detox, ripping up the receipt of unforgiveness to save ourselves from the toxic, cellular poison of chronic bitterness and unpacking our own backpack of self-punishment.
And finally, we discussed filling the void left by anger with the intentional SEO of gratitude and the connective tissue of empathy. We saw how setting healthy boundaries protects our peace, and how that inner peace inevitably scales up to heal our fractured relationships and our divided communities.
It is a massive, lifelong undertaking, but it is also so deeply, fundamentally hopeful because it means we are not stuck.
So after poring over all of these psychological texts, MRI studies, and spiritual wisdom, what does this all ultimately mean? What is the final lingering thought you want to leave our listener with today to mull over as they go back to their lives?
It comes down to this. If modern neuroscience proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that our brains are incredibly plastic, that they are constantly physically being reshaped and rewired by our thoughts, our daily habits, and our focus, right up until the very day we die, then the ultimate defining question of your life is this. Who is holding the chisel right now?
Who is carving the pathways?
Is it your past traumas carving your brain? Is it your inner critic? Is it the relentless expectations of the people around you? Or are you going to take the chisel back? Are your intentional choices, your grace, your tiny habits, and your empathy for today doing the sculpting?
Who is holding the chisel? That is incredibly powerful. Because, to circle all the way back to where we started, the X-ray machine might be broken when it comes to the human soul. The diagnosis might be murky, and the healing might be painstakingly slow and unglamorous. But the structural bones of who you are, they're constantly quietly knitting themselves back together.
You are entirely capable of profound structural change.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, right here, right now, at whatever battery percentage you are at, you are already enough. Your healing is valid and the journey is well underway. See you next time.